Hate can be a deeply stimulating emotion. The world becomes easier to understand and much less terrifying if you divide everything and everyone into friends and enemies, we and they, good and evil. The easiest way to unite a group of people isn't through love, because love is hard. It makes demands. Hate is simple. So the first thing that happens in a conflict is that we choose a side, because that's easier than trying to hold two thoughts in our heads at the same time. The second thing that happens is that we seek out facts that confirm what we want to believe. Comforting facts, ones that permit life to go on as normal. The third is that we dehumanize our enemy. Frederick Bachman, Beartown.
Welcome to Celebrate the Gray. This week I'm going to be talking about politics. I had a hard time figuring out how to start this one. I guess I'll start with a story about why I'm talking about it. As I mentioned in my opening podcast, A Different Way of Thinking, political talk radio played a big part in snapping me out of a malaise of myopia. I was the first in line to vote for Mitt Romney to ouster Barack Obama and rescue the country from an imminent socialist revolution. In 2016, I was the last in line to begrudgingly punch the button for Donald Trump as the lesser choice of two evils. In 2020, I swung completely to the other side and was the first in line to vote for Biden. Not necessarily because I loved Biden, but because the direction of the Republican Party was just not something I could get behind. When I was in middle school, my parents decided that the public school I was in, and in turn the high school I was headed to, was not the best thing for me. As an awkward, shy teenager, I was not happy about leaving the school I knew and the friends I had to start in an all-boys Catholic school. At some point, a couple of years into high school, after making some new friends and leaving my old friends behind, I heard some random stories of how much trouble some of my old friends had gotten into, including words like drugs, arrested, jail, etc. I then realized what my parents were doing when switching schools. They saw the path I was on that I couldn't see. Sometime before the 2016 election, my thoughts on politics started to change. If you want more on that, listen to my earlier podcast, A Different Way of Thinking. I was headed in a direction, ideologically, that I was not fully aware of and am not very proud of. Luckily, this time, unlike in middle school, I saw the path I was on and made a mid-course correction. Now looking back, I'm so glad I jumped when I did. When I start thinking about politics, I tend to get bogged down in the issues. But what I really want to say is more abstract than that. Issues are important, but I think an understanding of why we believe certain things and the effect that the current political structure has on us is the more important conversation. As I laid out the topics for this season and worked to draw them together with a through line, two common themes emerged. First is belonging, and as an extension, relationships. The second are cultures of power and control. First, what does politics have to do with belonging in relationships? They have more to do with politics than I would have ever guessed going into this. I've heard the following statement enumerated in a number of ways across multiple sources. We cannot reach our thinking brain without first establishing safety and security in the social brain. I remember in college, in Psychology 101, we were shown a video from an old Candid Camera episode of an experiment based on the work of social psychologist Solomon Asch. An unsuspecting victim of the experiment is on an elevator. One by one, 3 more people, all actors, enter the elevator, and each one faces the back of the elevator. You watch the face of the person facing forward, you see the indecision, the uncertainty, and then finally the reluctant acceptance when they turn and face the back of the elevator. Because they were in the minority, they conformed, because they didn't want to appear weird, because they thought the other people might have more information than they did. I've posted that clip of the elevator scene in the show notes if you want to take a look. Have you ever been out with a group of friends and ended up at a restaurant, bar, club that you really didn't want to be at all? Why? You didn't want to be a killjoy. Easier to keep your friends by going with the flow and conforming. Further research tied to Solomon Asch conformity experiments found that if there is just one dissenting opinion in a crowd, then others become eager to speak their true thoughts. In a commentary on Solomon Asch's work, James Surowiecki writes, ultimately, diversity contributes not just by adding different perspectives to the group, but also by making it easier for individuals to say what they really think. Independence of opinion is both a crucial ingredient in collectively wise decisions and one of the hardest things to keep intact. Because diversity helps preserve that independence, it's hard to have a collectively wise group without it. It is hard to have a wise group without differing opinions. Adding different perspectives makes it easier for people to say what they really think. I have 8 children. I can count on one hand and have a few fingers left over the meals that everyone will enjoy eating. Even the opinions around our most universally liked meal, pizza, varies when it comes to brand, toppings, crust style. So when I see a vote in the House of Representatives voted yay by 221 Democrats and 0 Republicans, I am led to wonder, what am I doing wrong that I can't get 8 kids to agree on Papa John's over Pizza Hut on a Friday night? I'm welcoming back to the podcast Nick Vincent. Nick joined me on a previous podcast, an unreliable narrator, and an interview with a good friend, where he shared some great thoughts on careers and identity. Nick has been on a similar journey as I have, from card-carrying Republican to more of a reformed moderate to maybe even, dare I say, liberal. I hope you enjoy. Thanks, Nick, for coming back onto the Celebrate the Gray podcast. A nice and easy topic this week is without any argument or division in our country. We're just going to talk about politics.
Just a couple of guys sitting back in the corner of McDonald's, sipping our coffee and discussing how we can make the world a better place. Is that kind of the theme for today?
Right, and then probably walking in the end and just looking at each other and say, did we accomplish anything? And then the answer will probably be no. But at least interesting topic, and hopefully start some conversations is really where I'm going with all this. I just told people kind of where I've started and come from and where I'm at with the political spectrum in our country and just kind of where we're at. I'd love to hear the same from you, just kind of
Sure.
where it started, how it changed, or you've had a similar change over time as I have, but I think a little bit different. So I'd love to hear, just get a starting point where you're at.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in rural Central Virginia, right? And the whole stereotype of NASCAR dads. My dad watched NASCAR and voted Republican, and probably has never voted for a Democrat in his life, with the exception of he voted against Johnson. That was the one time that he was like, I can't vote for anybody. Like I can't vote for Johnson. He pardoned Nixon. Like, death to Johnson. Like, and that was the only time I've ever seen my dad like fired up about politics, because if you vote the party line all the time, right? Like you just stick to your candidate. And so, as the son of a card-carrying Republican, it was my mantle to continue to vote Republican and carry on the tradition. I think my grandfather voted Republican on both sides of the house, so like it feels like it's one of those like tried and true passed on traditions that you just do as a course of growing up, becoming a man, voting Republican, right? And that's kind of how I always lived and how I always grew up. I got married moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, and Charlotte, North Carolina, at least Charlotte proper, probably has not voted Republican in the past, I don't know, 80 years, right? For most of its candidates, with maybe some exceptions of like Pat McCrory, who was kind of a moderate before he, jumped off the deep end. And so, for the most part, like I had a new perspective in like the media that I consumed, the conversations on local government, some of the positions, right? And then, you know, then I grew up, right? I got a little older. I started thinking for myself. I had, thoughts that may have been different than, what my parents had taught me. And, to begin to question like what's right, where do I want to stand, like where do I want the people to support me, and or and I started, voting sometime around the first Bush, right, or second Bush, George W. Bush, and then continue to vote mostly along party lines, and then probably at the time of like Mitt Romney and Obama, like that was when I like started struggling with like the dynamic between the glitz and the glamour of the Obama administration, and some of the failures with kind of Romney's promise of like a pragmatic and moderate approach to solving political problems. He was a well-respected sort of executor at the gubernatorial level, and I thought he was the right fit. And so like I realized that American politics had become very populist at that point, and that just bled into the Trump administration, and then ultimately now into the Biden administration. Right, we vote for the people that are either the most popular, the offer the biggest shiniest new toy, or the best tax breaks, and don't really solve some of the core problems facing government. And so that like the last like decade or so is where I've been really becoming more of a moderate, or maybe a liberal. I hope hopefully my parents don't listen to this podcast, but I think they have that indication that I might be a card carrying liberal.
Yeah, it seems like you've done it a little bit differently than mine. Was more yours was more jaded, I guess, maybe towards all the parties, but then leaning maybe more socially liberal. I don't know. I'm maybe putting words in your mouth, but
no, that's right. I blame my wife a little bit with sort of the helping me understand the Me Too movement, social justice. Right, she has read a 100 different books on like social justice issues, and so like I'm not a big reader, but I'm a good listener, and she's sort of said, hey, this is what the general thoughts in social justice are. Like here's where we might be misaligned in the way we've thought. Like what do you think about this? And oftentimes like if my wife is bringing up something that says, hey, what do you think about this, like I should start thinking about it, because obviously she's probably spent a dozen hours thinking about it, and it's probably something that is important, and she's usually on the bleeding edge and bleeding line of like what is going to be mainstream in some of those topics. And so she's challenged me and pushed me, and that's what a good spouse does, right? Like they challenge your point of view, where you guys might have a difference, and as a husband I have to like think, all right, if this is important to her, it's probably something that I should at least listen or think about or consider. And so she's planted a lot of seeds of where my head should be, both biblically and politically in this particular sphere. And I credit her for a lot of like the bigger thoughts that I don't often spend the time to think about.
You had mentioned back, you talked about Pat McCrory, who, if you're not from North Carolina, you probably don't necessarily know who Pat McCrory is, but he was mayor of Charlotte, and then was governor of North Carolina for a little bit. And you said something. He said he jumped off the deep end. He was moderate, and then he's turned more conservative. And I think that's a good jumping off point to discuss. Like it seems to a point that it's become either or at this point. You're either and you have to do it to get elected. You have to be staunch liberal, staunch conservative, or at least outwardly show that and vote that way and push that way. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
On how divided that's gotten?
it's so divided, which is I believe deep down inside that most people are socially conservative for the most part. Like the majority of people are socially conservative, but have liberal tendencies in certain areas. And so like there's a misalignment between a lot of the parties, and there's like this moderate group that I think a lot of people kind of fall in. Their principles both on both sides of the aisle that they typically agree with, but they have to align one way or the other. Like you don't have a choice. Like the platforms are so different. Like it always feels like they're so opposite across the aisle that you just have to pick. And so that stinks if you're a moderate, and no one ever puts a moderate on the ballot because they don't want the moderate on the ballot because there is a two-party system, and that always drives me nuts.
Yeah, the two-party system is. I really hoped this last year when it was Trump and Biden, and I thought, man, this is the perfect time to have, I don't know, Bernie Sanders and Mitt Romney run at the same time. So you end up with your conservative in Trump. You have to throw a socialist in there. You throw Biden in, who's really somewhat moderate. Like he's been in the Senate forever. And then a Mitt Romney, who's a moderate Republican, and then both parties would have to run.
Yeah, and no one's going to do that because they think their platform's the right one, and that's always tough. And then the media has bifurcated as well, right, along those party lines, and they appeal to whatever those party lines are to get eyeballs on the screen. And so not only is you have like party centric platforms and media outlets to support it. There's no moderate, like maybe you can watch PBS, right, like in the news hour, and like get kind of an unbiased, albeit boring, and something my grandparents would watch, but it's at least somewhat unbiased, right? But like you turn on the radio, turn on the TV, listen to podcasts, you're very rarely going to get kind of a vanilla view of the way it works.
So while we're here on journalism, let me ask you, where you do Instagram, I know. Do you do Twitter?
I did, but I got rid of it. It got a little much.
Okay. So, and then you do follow the news. So give me like the top 5 news sources you have.
So I typically do. I always read the Wall Street Journal. I'll read The Economist when I can, and then honestly, and this is a little embarrassing. Like I just spouted out the Wall Street Journal and The Economist, but like I use YouTube as like my primary like news snippet. And it ends up being an aggregator of anything that I can get for free, and it's whatever's curated by YouTube, based on my personal recommendations. So like that's like getting the soundbite, like, oh, there was a subway violence in New York this past week, right? Like just get general details. So it's more like fact finding. I use Twitter a lot to connect with like informational blogs and blog posts of like economists. I listened to a fair amount to like opinion pundits, right, on both sides of the aisle. So I probably consume in any given week probably, I don't know, five-ish hours of like news consumption throughout the week. That this sounds about an hour a day. In different media formats.
Does it tend to lean? Does it tend to lean a certain way?
It probably leans like fiscal conservative, bordering fiscal conservative is typically where I lean on like financial matters, and then like for social issues, I usually like follow social issues locally, because I think in that respect, like I'm more concerned about local issues than I am more national issues. So typically I'll follow like Instagram news curation, or follow like the local news, whether that's the Washington Post or whatever might have some local segments for the Northern Virginia area.
Yeah, I tend, from a news standpoint, I do the New York Times, Charlotte Observer, and then I listen to the New York Times daily podcast, the Washington Post podcast. But then we do not have cable, so I don't watch any cable news. If I want to hear about a story or something and I want to go directly to a source, I typically do like CNN. I don't know if that's good or bad or not, but the other place that I get a lot of my news is the Drudge Report. That's where I kind of keep my hand or feet dangled in
your listeners can't see my eyebrows raised, but I'm giving you a little bit of a side eye on that one.
The conservative aggregating. And I peruse through that once or twice a day just to kind of see what they're throwing out there.
But do you think consuming that media changes your opinion? Like seeing something on the Drudge Report, does it ever I didn't think about that, or do you take it with a little bit of a grain of salt?
Well, one, Drudge is less conservative than he used to be. During the elections, you could see, or maybe you just it was amazing when when you go to their site and you're looking at the things that are being aggregated, you can follow the paths. Like they're trying to build this. Drudge didn't like Trump, so he took a bend in this last election towards less conservative. So I haven't heard anything specific on that, but anyway, just kind of but then I do Twitter a little bit. Facebook, I've basically hidden a lot of people that used to be on my Facebook feeds, but journalism itself isn't journalism anymore, is kind of where I'm heading with all this. It's actually the other place I get a lot of news, just because I consume a lot of it, is actually the Dan Le Batard show, which is sort of a sports talk podcast, but Dan Le Batard was a journalist. And when he gets talking about journalism, he's very concerned about the state of journalism now. And he's really opened my eyes to the biggest thing I think that he has talked about. And he broke some he broke some scandals back in his day with the University of Miami, and they blame him for almost taking down the program back in the 90s with some of his writing. But he talks about when the New York Times, let's just say when they got a hold of Trump's tax returns a couple years ago, for the New York Times to come out and post a story about Donald Trump's tax returns, and it could be anybody's, if it was Biden or anything, I'm just talking about the story itself. The amount of layers that an organization like the New York Times goes through when it comes to the journalists and the editors and the lawyers and the editors and the lawyers and the editors and the lawyers.
Sounds like a bank.
If they're putting that in the paper, if they decide to publish it, they got it. With very rare exception, these major news organizations, when they print something, they got it. There's very rare that they have to come out and say, we got this wrong. So when you compare that to a blog on the internet, or even let's take it to like the Daily Show, for a while, Jon Stewart was considered one of the top newsmen in the country. He's a comedian. People are getting their news from Jon Stewart and taking it.
I do get a lot of my news from the Tonight Show.
There's a disc. They're not necessarily doing anything wrong, but they're not journalists.
Right.
And I think that's been taken advantage of, and for ratings purposes, really, that a Fox can come out and say things that aren't necessarily true because they're not being said by journalists. They'll handle it on the legal side if they have to. But people like to hear it, and it drives ratings, and MSNBC does the same thing on the other side.
Sure.
But you're not, you have to know the difference between a a columnist or somebody doing an op-ed versus somebody who's doing hard news. So I don't. You can respond to any of that. I kind of went on there for a minute.
When you were bringing that up, I was thinking of like a very very critical moment for me in my like news consumption was the death of Peter Jennings. If I think back to my childhood, my dad would get home at 5:30 every day. We would watch, I don't know, whatever the Wheel of Fortune or whatever was beyond, and then we do the local news. It was WSET out of Lynchburg, Virginia. They had the same cast of characters for like 30 years. Some of them I think still work there for that news station. And then we would watch Peter Jennings, right? ABC World News Tonight, and it was him reporting, and you felt like you could trust the news because he wasn't going to allow any fluff on his newscast, and like you just got the news. Occasionally, like he threw out like an aside, but like it was the tradition of like the Walter Cronkite. You report the news, you don't editorialize, and you provide people enough insights for them to make their own opinions. And like when Peter Jennings died, and you can look at like the ratings of the national news, and you can look at their editorial content and how everything transitioned, and like that for me was like such a critical moment for like seeing a transition in the news framework, because then that was about the time of really the explosion of CNN as a primary tool, and then the explosion of MSNBC, and then you had Fox News emerge, and then eventually you had this bifurcation that became very obvious. Like everybody started out a little bit moderate, right, to get some viewers and eyeballs, and then they realized really quickly they get more eyeballs if they went one way or the other, and that, like I can see the lineage and the steps, right? Like you can just trace it, like Peter Jennings and the nightly news evolves into an afterthought for most Americans, and then we have these cable news networks which are kind of becoming the primary source, and then we have Facebook now as the primary source, and all that control that the news agencies sort of had in terms of a sort of a very fixed and standard news rundown for the nation at large is now completely scattered, and it's so widespread with so many different news angles that you don't get the same 6 or 7 talking points that you would normally have at the water cooler. And there's no water cooler anymore, right? So we don't even have the water cooler to have those conversations. So it's been a kind of definitely it's definitely not as good as it used to be. And I worry about my children, because now I have to be very critical about teaching them how to be very discerning news consumers, and like they're pretty cynical. So I feel like I've done my job. I'm gonna pat myself on the back. Like anytime they hear anything, they're like, "Oh, well, this is probably what they're trying to do." I'm like, "Yes, okay, great. I did my job as a cynic and a dad."
Yeah, my first response to my kids are like, "Where'd you hear that? Who said it? Who said it?" Find out what their motivation for that is.
Yeah.
But even recently, like Jen's, is it Psaki? The White House press secretary announced she was leaving, and she was being hired by MSNBC. And
isn't that interesting?
NBC,
wow, there's a big surprise. Yeah.
Right. And NBC came out and was like, "You can't do this." MSNBC looked at him and said, "We're not hard news. We're just commentary. She's just coming to be. We're separate from you." And I was like, wow, I've never put that, and that goes to what I said about like Fox. It's MSNBC doesn't see themselves as a news organization, but a lot of people are going there to get their news. They see a delineation between NBC News and MSNBC.
Yeah, I always find it weird that there's so much apathy at the local level, and really those are the ones where the decisions are getting made that directly impact you on a regular basis. Like, hey, what should we do about property taxes? Hey, what should we do about spending in this particular road? Hey, what should we do about these particular police practices? Right, like things that impact you every single day, and we're completely apathetic, right? Like we don't show up to midterm elections, we don't show up to local off-cycle elections, and those are the most important. And yet, like the national ones with the president, which is obviously critical, but like honestly, like how much does Biden impact my day to day? Like other than like maybe Supreme Court justice appointments, not that much. Really, really doesn't,
Mhm.
right? And so I think people should really be educated on like where they should focus their time and energy, and they have so many different distractions and so many different media outlets and social media. And one of the great examples that Rebecca and I have seen in Northern Virginia is that we'll go to like sporting events with kids, right? And I know this is in politics, but it's kind of a a situation that I see where people just don't manage their time well. That kids will go to a soccer match and they'll leave like 10 minutes before the end of it because they have a lacrosse practice to go to. And then, all weekend they're running around like, worried about like all the different events their children are in, or all the different, events and groups and participation that they're doing personally. Like people just don't care about politics. Like they just don't want to think about it. But like they're not gonna like not vote in a national election because you got to get that Insta, for I voted sticker on your lapel, right? So it's always
Yeah.
tough. Like I really do feel like if people invested in local politics, that these issues would go away because there aren't as many like clear cut Republican conservative issues at a local level. It's like maybe with policing, like we can come up with different solutions, and there are some like clear cut lines, but most everything else, with you can kind of come up with some moderate approaches to solving some of these problems. Now, for your listeners, I'm a white dude making these comments, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt sometimes. But um, it's definitely politics should be local, and the news should be local, and we focus too much on the national level for what it's worth.
Well, the national has the money to put it in front of you, like the local elections can't. It's
Yeah.
just you're inundated with it. You can't help but get wrapped up in it. So why are people politicians? Why, as they move through, I have a hypothesis that the more local a politician is, probably the more pure the politician is. And I'm sure there's some outliers on that people are in it for power and fame and whatever and have bigger aspirations, but I think that's less. But I think the more you get towards the presidency and the Senate and the federal government, that number flips to where you have more people that are there for power and control and fame versus really what's the best for everybody. Is that do
So
you think
yeah,
that's a
no,
jaded view, or do you
I completely agree with that view. And I can at the local level, I can give you two examples. I have actually worked with two mayors of two two towns, and like I worked with them directly. One of them was a local city in outside of Charlotte. The other one is a pretty decent sized city in Northern Virginia. And we worked in the same floor, had conversations like hallway chats. They are the most genuine people you will ever meet. And they put up with a lot of frustrations in their after hours for like very small benefit, like in terms of financially. They really do believe that they're doing a public service, and that they believe that they're the right ones for the job because they're smart, honest, and genuine people. And so they do it because they feel like they can help the greater good. And at that level, like, they do, like, they show up at ceremonies, they help promote their towns. They think through really tough issues. They go to meetings in their evenings, like for very little benefit, right? There's no benefit other than like the prestige of saying, "Oh, I'm the mayor of this town," right? But like it's probably another full time job on top of what they're doing for not the same value because they're pretty well compensated people, so they're not doing it for the money. on the national
Yeah,
scene,
and
and like, you know, once you get like past like North Carolina politics, right, or Virginia politics, right, like it's somewhat big business, but like, I mean, for the most part, the people are just doing it as most of them are lawyers, and they're like, oh, I have some side time, and then I could use this as like a advertisement tool, or you know, I go into Raleigh every so often to see my friends, right, and so like it's not so much a big dollar influence; it's more of a prestige thing. But when you get to like the House, and really when you get to the Senate, it's the dollars they're talking about are just different, right? What was I seeing? Like one of the candidates at like a Senate level had raised like $10 million, and in a very short period of time, like it was like, oh, you know, some of the big power players gave them, you know, millions of dollars, and like I don't know as like a voter like how that $10 million actually gets spent. Like, does that mean they can go golfing with their, you know, as part of their like, you know, pitch, right? Does it end up like with like transportation and like clothing costs, right? And does it help support like trips, you know, to do additional fundraising or drum up support? It 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 always surprises me like where the money goes and like how it's traced. And like I know there's all sorts of reporting, but like anybody can fake a report or come up with a receipt or do whatever. And so it always worries me like when you toss out those kind of dollars, like it ends up being, you know, the money gets lost, and it influences things that it shouldn't influence. And so that big business stuff, it makes me a cynic, right? Like it automatically, anytime you throw out millions of dollars, or in the case of like Trump, hundreds of millions of dollars, and Biden, same thing, hundreds of millions of dollars. Where does that money go? Who gets rich from it? Like, how do we know that those grassroots efforts actually, you know, are helping the people that you know, supported the cause?
yeah, the 2020 election was over $1 billion in
It was over
spending,
$1 billion.
which is
Yeah.
yeah, crazy amounts of money. And I think people are they're making it really easy to become career politicians once you get to that level too. Because looking at some stats, 2014 Congress had an 11% approval rate and was reelected at a rate of 96%. So,
and those 4% were people that got like arrested for something, right?
Right. Or they
or
retired,
died,
or they
right? Or died, retired, or you know, whatever. Yeah.
But it's just people end up voting for the name that they know, and not enough people are voting. You know, 2014 was a non-election year, or non-presidential election year, so the turnouts were probably really low, and people just kind of voted for the names that they knew. And I think on top of that, and I kind of had this analogy when I was thinking about that, was if you go out to a restaurant and you're in a different city and you go to a new restaurant you've never been to, you're going to tend to look at the food that you typically order other places. Like
Sure.
when I was in college, I would eat, you know, a bacon cheddar burger wherever I went. It was just what I got. But if you have more information or a recommendation from someone, and you're actually having conversations, when you go into a restaurant in a different city and you've talked to a couple people who have been there, and they say, "Oh, you really should try the sushi," I'm less likely to try the bacon cheddar burger than I'm more likely to get the sushi, because I have more information.
Sure.
But when you step into a voting booth and you don't have any information, you're just going to say, "Okay, all right, George Bush. I've heard of him. I liked his dad." You know, I don't know. You don't have to respond to that. I just
no. I like this because I have to sort of come clean. I'm going to use this as a little bit of a confessional. My wife and I, whenever we vote, we go down the ballot more or less the night before, and we go to like all the different websites and where they stand on their platform, read kind of the news sections, and then we'll go through and like, what do you think? Oh, I didn't like this guy's picture. Like, we can't vote for him. You know, so there is some merit to like what you just said, in terms of you pick who and sometimes you pick the lesser of two evils oftentimes, in terms of candidates. But back to your conversation about being a professional politician. If you really think about it, being a senator is a pretty sweet gig, in terms of the value a senator gets for being in that position. One, you get, I don't know, $250,000 a year just to show up a couple months a year, right? You don't have to be full time, so it's not bad, right? Like those guys are mostly lawyers in some shape or form, but that's nothing to scoff at, right? $250,000 to do the work. You end up getting a staff, you get people to support you, you get people to run some of your errands and things like that. So there's that. You get speaking gigs as being a senator or former senator. You get lifetime benefits for and pension for being a civil servant, especially at that level. I mean, it's not so bad, right? Don't get me wrong. Those guys have to shake hands and kiss babies 365 days a year. So there's a cost to having that. But eventually it becomes kind of well-run machine. You have the right people, you pay them pretty well. You have consultants that you're friends with that you pay pretty well out of your, funding coffers. You influence policies and decisions. You have people in industries that will call on you any time of the day to get you to do stuff, and maybe you get some free tickets out of it, right, to go to the Masters, right? So I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world. I don't think I could do it, right? I don't have that disposition. I don't like talking to people all that much. But yeah, there are definitely some key perks to being a full-time politician, especially in the House or the Senate especially.
Yeah, and when you look at the history of it, that wasn't the way it was supposed to be. The reason they have sessions is because they were supposed to come to Washington, stay there for a little bit, and then go home and be in there. And it's just not happening anymore. The last thing I want to talk about is, because it's, celebrate the gray. There's a note I made here that I'm kind of talking about wedge issues. A wedge issue is something that you can get people to either say yes or no on, that there's not a whole lot of gray area. Or they portray it as there's not a whole lot of gray area. So since we're celebrate the gray, I'm going to say a lot of wedge issues are not black and white. And these are issues like the economy, abortion, guns, entitlements, that sort of thing. But when the way it's presented, and I'll take, I don't know, you could take the economy. The economy of the United States is incredibly complex. I mean, you're in banking, you understand that side of it, but the global trade and the import, export, and controlling the dollar and its value, and just, I mean, the complexity over the economy is crazy. So I was somewhere the other day and I just overheard a conversation, and it was like, Biden's jacking up the economy. I was like, one person cannot crash the economy. It's not Biden's fault there's inflation, just like it wasn't Trump's doing that, whatever. One person doesn't drive that. Thoughts on wedge issues and how, and it's really low information. Again, I think it's information. The more information people have, the less likely they are to just hear this is bad and this is good. Vote this way. Don't vote this way.
Yeah. I'm gonna touch two of the topics, and the second one is I'm gonna step outside of my comfort zone. The low hanging fruit is the economy, right? That wedge issue, right? Let's go back to that guy's comment. Biden is messing up the economy. There are some things that he definitely could have addressed differently. So let's think back. There's COVID, right? An historical shock to the world that nobody could predict it, right? And the fact that it's lasted as long as it has and we all have played a part in potentially the COVID situation. You couldn't have predicted that. So like I give him a pass on some of that. And then the fact that like we as Americans didn't spend money on like entertainment, we didn't spend money on uh, I don't know, fixing up her house because we were worried about people being in her house. So like we essentially sat on a giant pot of money that we would have normally spent, and like there's pent up demand. Then there's supply chain issues because COVID, people aren't making stuff. So if the supply is down and the demand is up, prices are going to go out of control, right? Like, could Biden have foreseen that? I don't know. I don't think so. Then the Biden administration goes out and like you get money and you get money and like people with 8 kids, you get lots of money, right? Like as a part of entitlement, right? And so I don't know if that was the right idea at the time, but like we were in a crazy economic situation, so like you had to do something radical. And if it threw the pendulum way too far, so that when the recovery happened, everybody got a job, well, I mean, it probably worked. It just now mortgage rates are going out of whack because the Fed has to signal that like we want to control inflation, right? And so because everybody has a job, now we have to worry about inflation. Well, I mean, is that such a bad thing? I mean, you could argue that it's okay. And by the way, we're gonna have like the beginnings of potentially World War III, and there are going to be like food shortages potentially because two large producers are now at war, or because there's going to be energy shortages because people are at war. So it's I think with that conversation in particular, there's so many nuances that like to say Biden's flubbing everything up. I I I think someone needs to like break out some newspapers and read some things other than Fox News. To be honest with you, and if I offended somebody, I don't care. Um,
You're just happy fun guy tonight.
I am. Yeah, rainbow and sunshines, maybe sprinkled in with some unicorns.
Yes.
So then I'm gonna jump over to my favorite Republican wedge issue, it's abortion, right? Like the topic of abortion. It's something that every Republican candidate since Roe v. Wade has put as part of their platform. It's something that every single one of them has said, I'm going to change this. And every single one of them has made marginal impact to it. We're decades in, and there hasn't been much of a change. With that being said, there's potentially a change on the horizon, and really that wasn't a result of politics. That was a result of stuff in the court, which is politics, I guess. But like they didn't change anything legislatively, which I feel has been a shortcoming for the party. But because they're the one that have said, "Hey, we're going to change this," they get credit for it. And I feel like Republicans should have held the candidates to a higher standard if that was such a platform issue, and I think they've gotten a pass. And it's something that like some people, that's the only issue they vote on. They don't care about, they hold their nose for everything else, and they vote straight Republican because of that topic. And they haven't held their candidates to the fire. They haven't challenged them. If it is such a key and critical, topic to them. And so that wedge issue is something that I feel like Republicans use as a topic, but don't do anything about it. And I think if we were really honest about, like, all the Republicans should be voted out of office just because most of them use that as their platform, and they critically failed. Now, I won't tell you where I stand, like, one way or the other on that topic, but I will tell you that, like, if I were a card carrying Republican, like I would vote every single one of them out just for that fact alone.
I mean, it's a winning strategy. I think it's getting a lot of people. Of course it is.
Elected. So yeah, it's brought so many people. Yeah.
Strictly political. Yeah. But Jesus and John Wayne, the book.
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, we talked about that one. Yeah,
exhaustive on how how the Republican Party changed and how the moral majority got attached to it, and how abortion became just the wedge issue to get in there. And again, and not from a moral standpoint, but it's disappointing, and I think it's a little scary on how many one issue voters there are. But
can I add just one more point?
Yeah,
just one more point. Yeah. I struggle calling myself an evangelical Christian. I do, and it's mostly because of the fact that politics has been tied so directly to that label. I won't pass up a chance to call myself that, because I want people to come to Jesus, and that's part of who I am and how I want to be. But it is something that is such an important part of me that I hold my nose and I say it anyway. And if people have preconceived notions of what that means for me and what I believe, then so be it. Because I feel like it's such a central tenet, central principle. But man, it makes me cringe every time somebody uses the name of Jesus, or somebody talks about their favorite Bible verse in a political forum, or even better, a pastor gives his political preferences in the pulpit, right? So I don't. It just drives me nuts. That one in particular, Jesus shouldn't be on anybody's lips in a political forum or setting, unless they're sharing the gospel with everybody in Congress. And if that's the case, good on them. I'm happy for them. Thanks for doing that. But other than that, like, you shouldn't use that as part of your platform.
I agree 100%. And that actually, in 2 weeks, when I release the next podcast on religion, that is one of the problems that I've had with the church. My political deconstruction, I think, kicked off my religious deconstruction, because I just couldn't. I don't know. I couldn't see the two attached like that anymore. But I'll get into that in a later. But just so everybody here doesn't think that we've gone completely like, Marxist socialists. There's a quote that I've heard, and I've heard it in different forms, but I found the actual quote, and I'll kind of leave it with this. And it's a quote I agree with. And it's Winston Churchill said in 1947, he said, "Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms of government that have been tried from time to time."
It's true. I am a flag waving American.
We have problems, no doubt about it. But you look around the world and there are some real problems. So where it goes, I don't know. But if we didn't care about it, we wouldn't want to fix it. Is kind of where I fall on politics, and as I'll go over on religion and church. So I'll give you the last word if you would like it. Mr. Vincent.
So how are we going to fix it, Steve?
That's a good time. I guess it's time to shut down the cameras and microphones.
I feel like we just got up, finished our coffee at McDonald's. I had a couple biscuits and we're walking out the door. Well, that was a good talk, Steve. Like, how would you fix it? Like, just.
It's about, we're recording this at 8:00 at night. I'm drinking a whiskey sour. I think it's about information. I think it's about learning. I think it's about stories and actually sitting and listening to people. I saw a study done recently that it talked about convincing people to change their minds on topics. And facts don't change people's minds. Stories do, like real life stories. So if you can take these wedge issues or any issues that are dividing people and get people to not see them just as facts or two people arguing on a screen, but actually, how does healthcare affect somebody who can't afford health? How does race relations how really are race relations in the inner city? How, I don't know. It's about actually thinking less about yourself and what you're listening to and what's just kind of moving you, and start thinking about how does this stuff affect other people that I have no idea how to relate to them. Because I mean, that's really, I don't have, we are two 40-year-old white men sitting here having a conversation. We have no idea what it's like to be a 20-year-old black man or a Hispanic that had to, risk life and limbs, swimming across a river to get into this country because they thought it would be better. Like, we don't have that. We don't have that perspective, and we can't unless we search it out. So I think it's about really trying your best to be empathetic and to understand what people are going through. Because my parents weren't super rich, but they were middle class, then upper middle class. I went to private school. I never missed a meal. I could do, baseball camps. I could do, I went to college and didn't end up with any student loans, and just on and on. So I was privileged in my view of the world now. I didn't think I was privileged then, but when I look back and I start to look around at experiences other people have had, I had it relatively easy. So since I've gotten a different perspective, my thinking has changed on a lot of issues. So that was a rambling.
No, I love that answer. No. I mean, it gets to the heart of it. Stories are the reason that we are here, and the way that it could potentially impact politics in the future, right? If everybody understands everybody else's story and we celebrate those stories, then we can potentially have a better discourse between both sides of the aisle. That was a really good answer. Thanks, Steve.
That's how you fix it, I guess, maybe.
But
I could be wrong. I don't know. Or you just blow it up and just start over. I don't know. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Steve.